APC and the PDP are seeking the reversal of the Supreme Court judgment of governorship elections to be definitely in their favors. And what do we make of this development, especially as the Supreme Court statutorily is a final point of arbitration and adjudication? So to make a sense of it all, a PDP lawyer and the former senior special assistant media to former Imo State Governor Adora Onyechere joins us from our Abuja studio. Also, Ogochukwu Swagu of the APC is also in our Abuja studio. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
So let me begin from, you're welcome. Let me begin from Mrs. Onyechere. Now, as a legal practitioner, there are other legal practitioners who think that, having this sort of cases go back to the Supreme Court from where we expect finality to be instituted is sort of making a mockery of the judicial system from the APC and both the PDP. I'd like to get your response to that. Don't you think there's a dangerous precedent being set here?
I think the question is addressed to me.
No, let's do ladies first. It's actually for Ms. Onyechere. So let's get her response first before we get yours.
Okay.
All right, thank you so much. First, I'm not a legal practitioner. I think, first of all, that's the correction I want to make. And I was SSA on information. And I'm here standing instead, first of all, as a citizen of Nigeria, and secondly, as also an indigene of Imo State. First, like I always like to point out, that the highest office in the land is the office of the citizen. And going by the question you just asked, and like I always say, and I will state here categorically, that yes, the highest court of the land is the apex court, which is the Supreme Court, and has the authority to give such judgment. However, we must also understand that there is also one law or one body that the Supreme Court is subject to, and that is the Nigerian Constitution. And going by the Nigerian Constitution and the laid down laws within the Constitution on such matters, especially if you're looking at Section 179, subsection 2A and B of the Constitution, you would find out that the apex court also, looking at the finality of that judgment, that it deserves to hear unfair hearing precedents, and also for posterity not to judge us, looking at the considerations that are being made on this case. First, we're looking at the issue where they are asking for, which of course is the case between Senator Hope Uzodinma and that of Right Honorable Emeki Hedioha, who was then governor of Imo State, is a case of setting aside the judgment based on nullity. And what they are asking for, first of all, is to look at the issues within the consequences of the case. One is the fact that, was it based on fair hearing? Secondly, are you also asking for it to set aside based on the fact that there were fraudulent issues or cases of fraud and deceit? You're also looking at issues considering along those borders. And you're also asking that, again, because of people and public policy, you are also entitled to make sure that all parties are able to get their grounds fair and share, to be able to have considerations for what is within the law. Again, you're asking questions based on the fact that this is not just an issue that is bothering within Imo State in itself primarily. You're looking at an issue that, if it is a trend that is allowed to continue to happen, you're not just looking at a case within the front burner of Imo State, you're looking at a case that would take precedence in the next cycle of election, where people would consider the case and the study of what happened in Imo State in this particular scenario and take precedence for this for the next election. People are going to say it is no longer enough for us to campaign. We will just wait for elections to come and then write results and then take it to the apex court. So I believe that as the number one court in the land and as the authority on the law, the apex court owes it to Nigeria, first of all, and secondly, owes it to the institution of the judiciary to make sure that the steps being asked to be taken, not just on Imo State as a state, but for country Nigeria as a brand, is looked into intermittently. And beyond that, it also gives a view that the judiciary in itself can look at itself and say, yes, there are areas of errors and there are considerations where mistakes have been made, and we are not even above the Constitution. And based on looking at the facts within the Constitution and public policy, I think the apex court understands what is at stake right here, not just for the people of Imo State or Nigeria as a whole, but us as a global understanding within the conversations as a leader within the African continent.
All right, let's bring in Mr. Oswagu here and get his perspective also as a member of the APC. So it would seem both parties have, in quote, benefited from the Supreme Court overturning governorship election in recent times. And again, I'll put the question to you. Don't you think there's a danger here going back to the Supreme Court? Don't you think it might undermine the Supreme Court, such that now the PDP is saying they will go as far back as the 2019 presidential election. So don't you think that this is perhaps not the right way to go?
Thank you for that question. First, even though I'm a member of the APC and I will not be here to take sides on issues that are clear in law. First of all, if we go by the one that has been causing this problem, the one of Imo State, right from time, my position has been that the INEC made a mistake by returning Emeka Ihedioha. I've always been saying it, that the returning officer was quiet and silent as to whether Emeka met the issue of Section 176 2B of the Constitution. It ought not to have been returned by INEC. And I think most of this blame should go to the Independent National Electoral Commission. And I expect by now that pressure should be mounted on the INEC chairman to have probably resigned from office for that political blunder. Be that as it may, the question now is whether in law parties are allowed to go back to the Supreme Court. The answer is yes. If you look at the case of amalgamated trustees and assisted discount house, which was decided in 2007, I think that is the reference point by which parties should look at. All Nigerians should read that case very well. Decided in 2007, the judgment was delivered by IT Muhammad, GSC. It laid down 5 grounds where parties can go back to the Supreme Court. One of them is if the judgment is obtained by fraud. Secondly, if the judgment was given in nullity, a judgment it says a nullity, then the party can go back to the Supreme Court. If the judgment also, if the Supreme Court was misled, or the judge or the court itself misled in giving that judgment, parties can also go back to the Supreme Court.
Right.
And also, if the court, the Supreme Court in this case, had given the judgment in the absence of jurisdiction, that's number 4. The parties can also go back to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
And for number 5, if the procedure adopted by the Supreme Court deprives the decision of the judgment of the character of a legitimate decision itself, then the parties can go back to the Supreme Court.
All right, Mr. Osuagu, I would like to pause you there. Now you have given a legal background, which is great. But then when we return, we'd like to talk about the issue of governance, because some are saying, if this is really about serving the people, why not wait for another election cycle where you can come again and vie for election? But that will be after the break. And add this to it, the fact that the race towards the 2023 presidency hits up as supporters of APC national leader Bola Tinubu tips him for the position. Find out more when we return after the break. So let's turn back to our discussion just before the break. Don't forget the APC and PDP have headed back to the Supreme Court saying, you know what, they want judgments to be turned in their favor. And we still have with us this afternoon former Senior Special Assistant Media to former Imo State Governor Adoro Onyechere and Ogochukwu Usuagu of the APC. Thank you so much for your patience. So on a final note now, I want us to talk about the issue of governance, because people ask the question, is this really about, you know, serving the people or holding on to power? And it begs the question, I mean, aren't there other ways to serve the people other than, you know, becoming a governor or taking up elective positions? So from this angle, do you still think it is wise to, you know, keep going back to the Supreme Court every other time? And that's for you, Ms. Onyechere.
I think what we should also be asking here is the precedent set in time. And like I said before, I think that posterity will judge us if we do not look at the considerations within this legal trajectory. First of all, you're looking at the fact that before you get to governance, you also have to look at the circle of leadership and the roles that show the examples of such leadership. The judiciary is an institution in Nigeria and also very, very particularly interested in the democracy of Nigeria. You're also looking at the independent national National Electoral Commission, which is all part of it. Now, if you look at the cases that we're looking at, for instance, what we're looking at in Imo, I do understand, and I say here again, that when you look at the fact that the court is also being asked whether it had jurisdiction to listen to that case in the first place is something germane for everyone to also be asking about. Because one, if we do not look at the considerations of this conversation, in the next election, such habits, such trajectory will be allowed to thrive. And then you're asking really, where is good governance? Where is the voice of the people? And where do we begin to actually ask ourselves if democracy is working?
All right, now, let's get Mr. Asuago's final thoughts on this. I understand this is a big issue, but let's get his final thoughts just before we move on the program. So, Mr. Asuago, you've seen the question I put to her. So for you, for your party, is this about serving the people for governance or about holding on to power?
Yes, I'm not one of those who subscribe to the idea of the parties, for instance, the APC going back to the Supreme Court for the review, simply because the PDP has done theirs in Imo State. Even though the APC and other parties, if they deem fit that they meet one of those 5 grounds I highlighted, of course they have the right to go back to the Supreme Court. But I want to believe that the party should look back inwards and see whether the applications being proposed do really merit it at all.
All right, that's a fine place to leave it.
The one of Imo State really do, something has to be done about it.
All right,
right
Mr.
from time,
Asuago,
I've always said it. If
I think that's a fine place to leave it. Don't worry, it's an ongoing conversation. We'll definitely revisit this in the coming days. But I'd like to thank you so much, Adara Onyechere, former Senior Special Assistant Media to former Imo State Governor, and Mr. Ogochukwu Asuago of the APC. Thank you so much for your time.